Welcome to this session of the history of popular music. This session is entitled Defining the American, Joplin Sousa and the Columbian Exposition of Chicago, 1893. Of course, you have a podcast episode to listen to for this session as well, so I'm going to keep this as brief as I can. The World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. This is Chicago from May 1st, 1893 to October 30th, 1893. Now, as you can see, it was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the quote-unquote New World. The fair had a major impact on architecture, sanitation, the arts, and Chicago's standing in the country. Not to mention, it was the occasion of the first serial killer in the U.S., or what's traditionally thought of as the first U.S. serial killer, H.H. Holmes, right? Around the same time as Jack the Ripper in England, right? And some people even think that maybe they were the same person. That's highly, highly unlikely. At any rate, you can see 1893, right? Columbus, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So it was meant to be in 1892, but instead it got pushed back a year just because of the size of the venture. I mean, this was a huge event, as we'll see. The fairgrounds, known as the White City, were designed in the Beaux-Arts style, with an emphasis on balance and symmetry. So similar to the buildings in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. This was a temporary section of the city. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It was built to be a temporary structure for this fair. And it occupied 690 acres and nearly 200 new buildings, canals, and lagoons, right? 200 new buildings and then also canals and lagoons. The White City and the exposition as a whole quickly became a symbol of American exceptionalism, that this was the modern America, and America was starting to take the lead in the global situation. Of course, that continues after the First World War and especially after the Second World War. But already here, this idea of American exceptionalism at work. Here you see the exposition space. Most of this isn't there anymore. It burned down in the Great Chicago Fire, but you could see it all laid out the way that it is with these artificial lakes and lagoons and so on. Here's a photograph of the White City, and you can see why it's called the White City. Obviously, everything's in white. You can get a glimpse of the Columbus Fountain as well, and we'll get a better picture of that in a moment. But that's over to the right there, and of course, there's the man-made lake and so on. It was around this time, by the way, also that in order to improve sanitation in Part 4 of this event, that they literally changed the direction of the Chicago River. Right, that's one of the great engineering feats of the late 19th century, and it was in part done for this. You had a whole bunch of different chapels, right? Tiffany had a chapel, and I'm sorry, you had all these different exhibition spaces, and Tiffany had a chapel, and you can see there the altar in the Tiffany Chapel. There were exhibition spaces for electricity. This is one of the places where the argument between alternating current and direct current was played out, right, between Edison and Nikola Tesla. That was played out here. All sorts of these modern marvels were being shown here at the Columbus Exposition. Here's the Columbus Fountain, obviously. This very ornate design with almost a life-size boat in the middle of that lake. Then you had the Midway Plaisance. This is the origin of the term Midway, and it refers to carnivals that include sideshows, right? And it contains several attractions and amusements that were separate from and prior to the charge for the main exhibition halls. So these were they were licensed, but they were not supervised in the same way as the things that were within the main exhibition space. And so some of the entertainments here were of sort of questionable moral worth or educational worth. The original Ferris wheel by George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. appeared there, and by some reports it saved the fair financially, that the fair was going bankrupt, and this ride was so popular that it made it solvent again. Inside the fairgrounds themselves were two-size reproductions of Columbus's three ships. So fully the actual size of the ships, and the first commercial movie house showing moving pictures to accompany lectures by Edward Muybridge on animal locomotion. And this might seem trivial to us today, but at the time, one of the great mysteries was how horses move. The idea was that they probably shoot out both their front legs and back legs at the same time, and then pull them in together, and that's how they're running. So they're pulling them in at the right before the moment of contact with the earth, and then they sort of push off. Well, if you think about that, there are some mechanical issues there. What Muybridge discovered through very fast photography, obviously, that he was able to put together as a kind of rudimentary moving picture and then slow it down, was that their legs are moving, in an ensemble, but actually they're moving separately. They're not moving in the manner of the two front legs and the two back legs at the exact same time, in the way that people thought. So just these kind of things were part of the among the marvels of modernity. There it is, the world's first Ferris wheel, right? And it didn't open until June, and by that point the fair was going under, and the this ride was so popular and sold so many tickets, and of course Ferris had to pay a certain amount to the fair itself to have it there, and that helped make the whole thing financially solvent. Other things you'd have on the Midway Plaisance would include things like this, right? These sort of fake Egyptological exhibits where you're going to see these mummies. They were fake mummies, they weren't real, but people didn't know that. And there were belly dancers and palm readers and all sorts of things like that were out there as well. When you got into the fairgrounds, those were the things in there were supposed to be more educational about and artistic, like Tiffany and like the whole electricity debate and so on. Well, one of the things that also was supposed to be educational inside the grounds would be the music there. And this is where Theodore Thomas, the director or conductor rather of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, comes in, right? He was asked to coordinate all of the musical performances for the entire coordinate the musical performances for the entire exposition, and to conduct numerous symphonic concerts. And he hired like a whole bunch of his friends from across the pond, from Europe and so on, to come and perform here. And he put a lot of effort into it. But the audiences just didn't respond. They didn't come to his concerts. One of the reviews from the Chicago Tribune wrote that, quote, "The people should be given more music. The regular concerts," by which they meant, of course, Thomas's concerts, "excellent as they are, only appeal to musicians and connoisseurs. And to this extent, they answer their purpose admirably. But the people want more outdoor music." Now, you might be asking yourself, what the heck does outdoor music mean, right? I mean, he's performing a lot of these he's performing some of the symphonic concerts in a hall, but some of them he was doing outdoors. So what is outdoor music in that sense? Well, what he means is this. John Philip Sousa, right? These marching bands, and we'll see that marching, in a sense, goes in quotation marks. But this is what is meant by outdoor music, right? This brass band music. Because the U.S. at this time was in the midst of an extended period of brass band culture. After the Civil War and into the first decades of the 20th century, most northern towns had a brass band to play concerts and parades and events, right? Most towns, no matter how small, had a brass band. And they were derived from the marching bands that were the military bands, right? But they were now playing more popular music. They were still playing marches, but they were playing sort of popularized marches. They were playing light classical pieces. They were playing little bits of operetta sometimes with violins playing the vocal part, sometimes with someone singing, but usually not. And then they were playing pop tunes, including minstrel tunes, as we'll see, right? By 1889, one journalist reported that there were over 10,000 such bands in the U.S., and most of these were in the North. The South had their own thing, right? And they proffered an interesting mixture of patriotism and popular culture. So the South, they had less of an impact until the early 20th century in the South, and then you see more brass bands in the Carolinas and so on. In the South, by and large, it was string bands, and we'll come back to that. Now, the standard brass band had at least 10 members, and most bands were roughly 17 players. There were male and female bands. So one of the really popular ones was the Helen May Butler's Ladies Military Band. Notice, obviously, at that time in the early 20th century, women weren't in the military, so they don't mean that literally. They mean that it's a military band in the sense that it's a brass band, right? Playing this music associated with military music, or derived from it in a sort of distant sense. The famous professional bands were much larger, 80 to 100 performers in a single band. So clearly some of these are not marching bands, right? Some of them could march in parades and so on, but you're not going to get 100 people to play together and be able to march and hear what the heck's going on, right? So there were certain events where you would have these huge, humongous brass bands, like I said, 100 performers playing at these seminal events where people would come and it would be a big deal. John Philip Sousa is probably the most popular band leader of that era, especially of these kinds of bands. He was known as the March King. He conducted the U.S. Marine Band starting at the age of 26, as well as his own commercial band. And he wrote many famous marches, including, of course, the Stars and Stripes Forever, the U.S. National March. Sousa was key in the history of copyright as well. He helped negotiate royalty payments with publishers, and he was part of a Supreme Court hearing that I talk about a bit in the podcast episode that created more stringent guarantees for composers, not just publishers, but for composers when it came to copyright laws. He wrote in his autobiography, "It seems to me that the principles of this type of music, outdoor music, military music, marching band music, whatever you want to call it, but that the principles of this type of music might be so far elaborated and utilized as to reach the entire world directly and effectively. My theory was, by insensible degrees, first to reach every heart by simple stirring music, secondly, to lift the unmusical mind to a still higher form of musical art. This was my mission. The point was to move all America, while busied in its various pursuits, by the power of direct and simple music. I wanted to make music for the people, music to be grasped at once." Now, there's a lot to take apart in that little mission statement, right? First of all, notice that he's saying something very similar to what Stephen Foster was saying about minstrel music, that he's going to start by appealing to people's heart, by appealing to their sense of humor or whatever, their sense of the popular, and then slowly, by degrees, right, bit by bit, lift their artistic sensibility so that they're reaching a higher form of musical art. Not a symphony exactly, and we'll see he actually thought less highly of symphonies than you might imagine. But this idea of taking the popular and making it into art, using the popular in a sense as a kind of material to create art, right? So we see the same kind of thing that we saw before. And notice what he's saying. He's saying that America's so busy, they don't have time to learn all about Beethoven and so on. So they need a kind of music that's more directly accessible and yet still uplifting and important, right? Because they're too busy doing other things, is what he's saying. And he wants music that's for the people, that's going to be grasped at once, and yet still be high quality music. This is consumer culture, right? He wrote in another place, "If I want to write a march, I turn my imagination loose upon scenes of barbaric splendor," right? And I talk a lot about this idea of barbaric splendor in the podcast, so I won't spend too much time on it now. But he writes, "I picture to myself the glitter of guns and swords, the tread of feet to the drum beat, and all that is grand and glorious in military scenes. Few of the great composers have written great marches because they lived in the atmosphere of peace, away from the barbaric splendor of war and the clash of swords. This exciting quality is missing in their work." Now, of course, that last part is total BS, right? Beethoven lived during the Napoleonic era. He knew plenty about war. Right? He didn't live in an era of peace. And the same applies to Mozart at various times, various issues that Austria had in military history. Certainly, if you go to the 17th century, right, and the early stages of classical music, or Baroque music, actually, in that case, there's the 17th century is sometimes thought of as a century of wars, of great wars. So he's wrong about that. But notice that there's a kind of ideology he's building here, that this music is exciting because it's tied into what he thinks of as barbaric splendor. So on the one hand, the splendor, it's this aggrandized experience in the form almost of the way we think of art, right? Art is often characterized as having an aspect of splendor to it, something that shines forth in beauty. But then the barbaric are more animalistic nature. Here we see one of his touring bands. This is Sousa's quote-unquote marching band, and the reason the quotes are there are obvious. There's a harp, right? You can't march with a harp. And so this wasn't really a marching band. They would perform seated. But you can see there are a couple women in the group, one that plays the harp, and then another playing the violin, and so on. So some of these people were in the military before, just as Sousa was, but they're not now. Now, Sousa hated recordings. He wrote an essay in 1907 called The Menace of Mechanical Music, in which he said, sweeping across the country with the speed of a transient fashion in slang or Panama hats, political war cries or popular novels, comes now the mechanical device to sing for us a song or play for us a piano in substitute for human skill, intelligence, and soul. So notice he doesn't think highly of phonograph recordings, right? He compares it to a kind of silly fashion, right? Popular novels and Panama hats. He's denigrating it, and he mentions and emphasizes the mechanical nature, right? That these things that should be about being human are becoming mechanized, and for him that's a problem. But still, and I talk about this more in the podcast, but still he allowed, starting in 1893, members of his band to record, even using his arrangements. And so these recordings, conducted by people like Arthur Pryor and Herbert L. Clark and Walter B. Rogers, they became very famous, and they're good representations of what the Sousa band sounded like at that time. So we can hear more or less what the Sousa band sounded like, even though very few recordings exist with him actually conducting. Here's Herbert Clark, right? He was a cornet virtuoso. A cornet is similar to a trumpet, but it's not identical. It's got a slightly mellower sound. And he recorded his composition, Caprice Brillante, with the subtitle The Debutante, with Sousa's band for Victor Records on October 21st, 1908. And this record had a huge influence on trumpeters and cornetists of the future, or even of that era, including Louis Armstrong, right? Louis Armstrong learned quite a bit from this recording, and he even kind of pseudo cites it on West End Blues. He alludes to it in various ways, and this was a very popular recording in 1908. Remember, 1908 still, as we'll talk about soon, very much the early days of the recording industry. Another great example of the precision of the Sousa band on record is the Falcon March from 1910, conducted by the trombonist Arthur Pryor. Pryor rearranged the composition specifically to make it shine on record. He clears out some space. He takes out some of the doubling and so on, so that you can really hear the bass. The bass part's quite impressive in that song, and the bass was a problem for early recordings, as we'll talk about soon. In 1910, when this was done, the bass parts tended to make the needle jump, and so they were very hard to record. And how he did it, I'm not exactly sure how he got quite that sound, but it's for 1910, the Falcon March is a quite remarkable recording. He also recorded many cakewalks and rags, and we'll talk more about rags and ragtime in a moment. He recorded the Trombone Sneeze, a humoresque cakewalk, in 1902 for Victor. And note the prevalence in that recording of trombone smears, which we think of really as being part of early jazz, but they probably derive really from minstrel practice, and that seems to me where he's probably getting this. They add a new effect to band music, and one that gets used in ragtime quite a bit. There are also some blue notes in that recording and a little bit of improvisation. It's a pretty remarkable recording. Again, for 1902, it's extremely remarkable. Here's Arthur Pryor holding his trombone. So it's around this time, the turn of the 20th century, 1895 to 1918, that we have the ragtime craze, right? And this is syncopated music. Ragged is perhaps just another way of saying syncopated. That began as dance music in red light districts in African-American venues in St. Louis and New Orleans in particular. And it seems to have been, in part, an attempt to add syncopation to the marches of composers like Sousa, right? Perhaps combining rhythmic aspects of minstrel music, the constant activity, the syncopation, the staccato notes that bring to mind a banjo, and then the form and the meter of the march. And so you have the same kind of form that you typically have in marches, the additive form, right? Marches tend to be A, B, and then sometimes another A, and then C, D, E, or whatever, so that you have a little bit of internal repetition, but usually it's just immediate repetition, right? A gets performed twice, B gets performed twice, then you sometimes get a return of A, usually just performed once, then two C's and two D sections, right? So you're just stringing together loosely related music. Again, I talk about this more in the podcast. Now, important composers of early ragtime include Ernest Hogan. He was one of the pioneers and may have even coined the term. He might have invented the term ragtime. In 1895, he published two of the earliest rags to be published, including the song All Coons Look Alike to Me, which is one of the ones I want you to listen to, and then the La Pamela rag. Also in 1895, Carey Mills, a white classically trained violinist, released the first... Ernest Hogan, by the way, was a black composer and one of the very successful black composers of that era. And the fact that he wrote what are sometimes referred to as coon songs is something that came back to haunt him later, as I talk about in a different lecture. Carey Mills was a white composer, and he released the first published ragtime cakewalk with the song Rastus on Parade, and he followed that in 1897 with the very popular self-published song A Georgia Camp Meeting, and that gets recorded quite a bit early on. Sousa's band recorded it, for instance, in 1908. The first song with ragtime accompaniment was probably Burt Williams' Oh, I Don't Know, You're Not So Warm, a kind of comic song from 1896. Of course, one of the most celebrated composers of this era in ragtime was Scott Joplin, right? Joplin became one of the most celebrated composers of the genre and had major hits, including, of course, his huge breakthrough was Maple Leaf Rag in 1899 and then The Entertainer in 1902. And he uses the typical march patterns that I mentioned already, A, A, B, B, A, and then C, C, maybe C prime, and then A, A, B, B, A, C, C, D, D. That's a very typical one. Or even A, A, B, B, C, C, A. That one's a little less typical, but Joplin does it a bit. Here's a cover for The Entertainer, and you can see it's clearly building on minstrel tropes, right? This is a guy that's clearly in blackface. He may or may not be an actual black person, but as you know from the podcast episode, in late minstrelsy, it was very typical to have black people in blackface, and that looks to me like what's probably being depicted here, although I can't be sure. But he's clearly on a stage performing in front of a white audience, and so that's being tied into the Maple Leaf Rag. A much more, even more, I'd say much more, but even more questionable cover is the first sheet music released by Scott Joplin, and that's this one. This is Original Rags, his first publication in 1897. And you can see there that on the wall of this shack, so what you have there is a rag picker. So there's a bit of a joke, right? Ragtime music, rags, you call a piece of ragtime music a rag, and so this is Original Rags, right? So this song that he's claiming is one of the originals in that sense. And then what you have depicted there is a rag picker. A rag picker is someone who, kind of like a recycler of the 19th and early 20th centuries. You find rags in the trash and from people's things that people are throwing out or whatever. You collect them, and they get laundered and then made into washcloths and things like that. It's a low form of employment, obviously. You can see that this poor gentleman here, a black gentleman, is a rag picker, and he's living in this shack, I guess, with a broken door and a window that's busted out and some shingles that are falling off. And he's clearly a kind of minstrel character as well. Let's zoom in on this a bit. And you can see the deep red lips and the hunched over back, and he's clearly impoverished. So there's a lot of minstrel stereotypes that are going into this. Now look at the sign on the wall, right? It says picked by Scott Joplin and arranged by Charles N. Daniels. Couple things to be said here. picked makes it sound like Scott Joplin is a banjo player who's just sort of coming up with this tune, not writing it out, and then someone else comes along and arranges it. None of that's true, obviously. Scott Joplin didn't play the banjo at all. He was a pianist. He was a very talented pianist. So he's not picking the tune, whatever that might mean, but rag picking, that's what the play on words, right? Just like this fellow's picking up a rag, that's called rag picking, and so that's part of it. So Scott Joplin, in this sense, is being denigrated to the level of a rag picker. The idea of just picking the tune is meant to be the natural propensity for music of black people, instead of the more formal notion of a composer who's working out the ideas intelligently and writing them down. Now, another thing that's interesting is, of course, the arrangement wasn't done by this Charles N. Daniels. In fact, as far as I know, Scott Joplin didn't know Charles N. Daniels at all. Daniels was a friend of the publisher, Carl Hoffman. And so this was a way of giving Daniels a little bit of money that he didn't earn, right? He didn't do any arranging here. This is a tune that was written by Scott Joplin, arranged by Scott Joplin, and early on performed by Scott Joplin. Daniels had nothing to do with it, but that's how corrupt the music printing industry could be. Music industry in general has been corrupt from the very beginning and continues to be. You can see a little bit of the opening of original rags, and notice the syncopated figures, right? Da 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 da, right? And that kind of syncopation is very typical. And then when you look at the main melody, about halfway through the second system there, da ba da da ba da 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 ba da ba 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 da, right? That's familiar from a ton of other rags. Here you have the original cover for Maple Leaf Rag, and again, you're working with these minstrel stereotypes, right? These are Zip Coon figures very clearly. But as Scott Joplin became famous as a composer, he begins to earn more respect even on the covers. So let's take a look at a 1904 cover. Here we have it, a 1904 cover of the Maple Leaf Rag, and notice that now Scott Joplin's picture is on there. It's a press picture, right? And the King of Ragtime writes, right? So here we have him being lauded as the King of Ragtime. He's named as the composer of Swipesy Cake Rock and Sunflower Slow Drag, which is one of his great ones in my opinion. The Maple Leaf Rag is just a maple leaf here on the cover, right? So not denigrating him, not using minstrel stereotypes and so on. But that's rare, right? This idea of a black composer getting any kind of respect is fairly rare still at this time, extremely rare. Now, like a lot of these ragtime songs, this one had lyrics put to it, and this is again building on some minstrel dialect and stereotypes. But when Maple Leaf was started, my timidity departed. I lost my trepidation. You could taste the admiration. Oh, go away, man! I can hypnotize this nation. I can shake the earth's foundation with the Maple Leaf Rag. Right? You can listen to the tune and get a sense of how these... Obviously, the tune was written long before. It was written in 1899, so 5 full years before. And Sidney Brown puts these lyrics to it in order to then sell it as a song and make more money, right? And you can see all the emphasis on these sort of somewhat highfalutin words. They're used mostly correctly, and yet they seem just a little awkward. That's a typical thing in late minstrelsy. The Coon Band Contest, 1906. This is an Arthur Pryor ragtime march that he recorded with the Sousa Band. And that also includes some smears and a surprising freedom of tempo toward the end. And then you have the Ken Hannibal rag in 1911 with more freedom with respect to the beat and falling behind the beat, sort of setting up some things that will become important in early jazz. Now, one of the things that happens with ragtime is, again, when we start talking about the early recording era, pianos didn't record that well. They made the needle jump. But what did record extremely well, without sounding murky at all, was the banjo. And so a lot of these rags had more success being recorded, at least in the selling of recordings, not sheet music, with the banjo rather than the piano. And one of the great performers there was Wes Osman. He made the first ragtime recording ever in 1896 for Columbia, called Ragtime Medley. And then he went on to record as a soloist with an orchestra and with a trio, banjo, mandolin, and harp guitar. 1906, his trio recording of St. Louis Tickle. That's one of his great recordings. The B section of that song is known as the Funky Butt. It was a separate tune and named after the bar in New Orleans, and it's connected with the unrecorded but celebrated early jazz cornetist Buddy Bolden. Many people think that Funky Butt was a tune written by Buddy Bolden or improvised by Buddy Bolden, and it was so popular that other artists borrowed it, and that's what Wes Osman's doing. Jelly Roll Morton claimed it was written by Bolden, and he called it Buddy Bolden's Blues, right? In 1907, Wes Osman records Maple Leaf Rag with the Prince Orchestra, and it's a remarkable recording. He's a true virtuoso. Slightly sloppy, but in an extremely exciting way, right? Wes Osman was one of the great performers. He lived kind of a tragic life, died of alcoholism, like a lot of these guys are doing, but some really, truly interesting early recordings. His rival and follower was Fred Van Epps, who was very different in some ways from Wes Osman. Van Epps was faster and cleaner and more precise than Osman, but he was also less funky. He was less exciting. He learned to play by listening to and emulating Osman's records. And this is the first example I can think of, or that I know of, where someone is learning to play music through recordings. That simply hasn't happened before, right? And of course, that's a lot of what happens now. That's how I learned to play guitar, was by listening to recordings and trying to figure out what they were doing, and often getting it wrong and then figuring out how to get it right. Right, so ragtime becomes a kind of concert music with Van Epps, and it starts to fall from favor in a way. It's not as exciting anymore. It becomes this kind of pseudo classical music. Persiflage from 1925 is a good example of his sort of performing where ragtime's starting to lose some of its verve, even though it has this kind of quasi classical perfection to it. All right, that's it for this session. Make sure you listen to the podcast episode, and I'll see you at the next session.